Now, so far, we have only explored the standard sprite channels. There are other channels located at the top of the score that serve more specific functions. These are called the effects channels, and we'll cover these channels in more detail later, but we'll begin now with a brief introduction to each. Now, depending on who last used your machine, these channels may not be visible. If yours are missing, simply click the Hide Show Effects Channel button here to make them appear. Clicking it again makes them disappear. Now, let's move this up here. At the top of the effects channels is the tempo channel, which tells director how long to pause on each frame in the score. As mentioned before, the default tempo setting is 15 frames per second. Now, you may not have seen it progress through every frame because this video is only 5 frames per second, so it's going to leave out some of the frames, so you won't see it hit every single frame. But anyway, we can change the tempo at which the playback head progresses through the score by double-clicking on a cell in the tempo channel and specifying a different tempo. Let's do that. Say 5 frames per second. Okay, so we can change it here by sliding it. We can also be a little more specific using the arrows. We can try anyway. Okay, so we're at 5 frames per second. Now this means that from this point forward, the playback head will pause for 1/5 of a second on each frame in the score. We could go to a point later in the score, say here, and change the tempo back to 15 frames per second by double-clicking and moving this back to 15. It will let us. Sometimes it skips a couple. Okay, so that's at 15. Say OK. And let's actually just make sure that our movie starts out at 15 frames per second by going to the beginning of the movie, double-clicking on that cell, moving it back to, say, 15. Say OK. Now, can you predict what will happen here? Think about it for a minute. Let's move the score out of our way so that we can see what happens. Move it up a little bit more. Okay, so we can see everything. All right, now let's rewind and press play. Okay. Now notice how the playback head slows down and then speeds back up. All right, when the movie starts, it's at 15 frames per second. Gets to frame 10, it slows down to 5 frames per second. Then it gets to 20, it speeds up to 15 frames per second again. So that can be useful for you when you're doing your animation, depending on the level of detail that you want and things like that. We'll get into animation more later. Now next, in the effects channels, these are the effects channels here. Next in the effects channels is the palette channel. Now we won't cover this much right now, except to say that this allows you to specify the range of colors used for graphics in a particular frame. We may cover this in more detail later, but for right now, let's just leave it at that. You don't have to worry about it. Now below the palette channel is the transition channel. This channel holds information about how changes between the preceding frame and the current frame are dealt with. For instance, whether a dissolve is used to transition between these frames or a wipe. Double-clicking on a cell in the transition channel allows us to specify a transition. Let's do that right here between these two frames. Double-click. Okay. The transitions are organized into categories. Choosing a category displays the transitions available under that category in the frame on the left where it says Transitions. Now let's choose the category Wipe and the transition Wipe Left. We could also adjust the parameters of the transition, such as the duration or the smoothness, but let's just leave them as they are for now. Okay, so we say OK. Now notice that adding this transition to our score also makes it automatically appear in the cast. We should probably name this transition. Let's just call it Wipe. It's a good idea to name all of your cast members. Okay, so we have a transition. Now, it's true, transitions are considered cast members. They're not just pictures and sounds. They're also effects, things that tell director what to do. And because it's a cast member, we could reuse this same transition later by dragging it to another cell in the transition channel. We could drag it there, and we'd have that transition there as well. Okay, let's rewind and press play and see what that looks like. Should wipe. Now, because of the frame rate here, this may be kind of spotty, but we'll just see. Notice it wiping from the left, then it progresses on. We'll watch that again. Watch it wipe from the left. Right here, it's wiping from the left. That's a transition. Hopefully you could see that. Okay. Now, transitions can add a lot of interest to a presentation, but one should be careful not to use them. Usually what you'll use them for is for changing between screens, and we'll show that in more detail later. But for instance, if you go from one, like the main screen to a sub-screen, you might transition by having it sort of fade in or something like that. Okay. Now, below the transition channel, we have the sound channels. There's one sound channel and sound channel 2. And again, we'll deal with these channels in more detail later, but let's suffice it to say that this is the soundtrack of your movie. Your movie can be in stereo, which is why there are 2 sound channels. Okay. In order to play a sound in your movie, you have to add a sound cast member to the sound channel at the spot in the score where you want that sound to play, and you will put that into the sound channel. You can't just put your sounds into any sprite channel. Okay. Now finally, at the bottom here, we have the frame script channel, which is also known as the behavior channel. The terms script and behavior are used sort of interchangeably here. So this is the frame script channel or the behavior channel. Again, we'll cover this in more detail later, but this is one of the places where you place scripts or behaviors in your score. When placed here, these scripts or behaviors tell director what to do when it enters or leaves a frame. For instance, you may want the computer to beep when it enters a particular frame. Suppose you wanted it to beep when it entered frame 1. Then you would add a behavior to this particular cell so that when it when the playback head entered that frame or left that frame, a beep would play. You might also want the playback head to loop in a particular frame. That's something we're going to be doing here fairly shortly. You might want it to just stay in this particular frame, in effect pause on it. And you might enter a behavior here that tells the playback head that whenever it leaves this frame, go back into the frame. So it'll just sort of loop here on this one spot. We'll show you that in more detail. But for now, we'll just leave it at that.